I'm Kristina Pereckaite, and I'm here with Sarah Osterholzer. And we were recently discussing how much of an impact the books that we've read this year have made on us. And we really wanted to share this discussion with you.
So just for a bit of context, so Kristina set up a book club around this time last year, and we've been meeting up with a small group of other entrepreneurs and committing to read at least one book every month, and then we can review it and discuss it at the end of the month. So we've got through some books, like Kristina said, and we're wanting to just take some of the top ones that have had a real impact on us as individuals, but also maybe looking at our business as well, and just share really our thoughts and experiences around that.
Awesome. So actually, I think what might be interesting to start with is one of the first books we read. I think we started reading it just before the end of last year and into the new year, which was Atomic Habits. And I think what's quite interesting is the book that you tend to read at the beginning of the year can set you onto like a really interesting journey for the rest of the year, because it was quite appropriate because we started reading Atomic Habits by James Clear, I believe it is. And having started reading that book around how to form good habits whilst also trying to read more this year, it was a really good way to start. One of the most interesting things that came out of it for me was around looking at things as processes rather than results. So for example, and this was mentioned in another book we read later in the year, which was Deep Work. So if you're trying to accomplish something like you want to write a book, for example, which is a huge task, both, actually getting it done, the amount of time it takes, the research, but also just motivating yourself to sit down and write so much. And something that James talks about and also in Deep Work is if you focus on what you have to do there and then rather than what you need to achieve. So rather than I need to write a book this year, you might say, I'm going to write for an hour every day this year. I mean, that might be a little bit too much, but focusing on process. And James put it in a really interesting perspective that if you can do anything for 2 minutes. So if you just set yourself a goal for, I'm just going to write for 2 minutes every day, you really can do anything for just 2 minutes, stick that timer on and you can do that. And I've always been a huge goal-oriented person. And so reading that book really changed my mindset of always just saying, right, I have to do this by the end of the month. I have to do this. And not always accomplishing those and making myself feel quite rubbish about myself. And instead focusing on, right, you just need to do this for 30 minutes every day. And I naturally started to see more results, to, complete more things that I've written and articles and things like that, because I was focusing on process. I definitely like that's, some books you say like, oh, I really want to implement this. And you don't always do that. You just kind of put the book aside. But the Atomic Habits book is something I genuinely use throughout the year. So at the beginning, I looked at my whole kind of life around friendships, work, reading, hobbies, and applied that exact process of, what can I do every day rather than what's this other big thing I want to achieve, putting all this pressure on myself. One of the best things about it was I actually enjoyed it more, which you think you wouldn't. Yeah, because you're actually achieving more things. You feel like you are getting somewhere rather than always saying you'll write that book, always saying you'll write more articles and never really seeing that big result you've set for yourself as a goal.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah. I think there's something about process. I'm very process driven anyway. So for me, and I think there's a few of the books you've read also have had some sort of structure, and I think it made it really easy. So one of the books I read that was very structured was it's called Clockwork by Mike. I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name, something with an M as well. And it is very much that as well. It's like, if you want to set up a business that kind of runs without you being there, so it runs kind of like clockwork without you being there, here's some steps. He's very kind of step orientated as well. I think it also makes it a bit more like easier to digest something, because like you said, when you want to take something on, you're always like looking at the big picture, and especially when you're also looking at other businesses, you're like seeing businesses set up and you're like, how do I go from just an idea to kind of getting it set up and all those things. So having some sort of map or step can make such a big difference. So for me, I think I can kind of relate to that process, but I think I'm very process driven anyway. So for me, anything, give me a process, I'm like, great, take it on.
Yeah, and Clockwork is definitely on my list for 2021. I'm really excited to read that one. What was a big one for you this year, Sarah?
So I think another one for me that made a massive difference was Never Split the Difference.
We've talked about this book so much, haven't we?
I think it's just one of those books that, like, so I think one thing that Kristina and I both kind of shared when we were reading it was that like negotiation and talking about like money just isn't comfortable, and it's just been always our lives like that. And reading a book which, first of all, is so interesting because it's written by a hostage negotiator. So like just the story and the context and that element of it is really exciting. But again, just talking about some really key things that can make a real difference to how you think about negotiations. So one thing I thought was really cool was like, he just sets the scene of like a negotiation, people think of it as something that's going to be a conflict. So you're really going into it with all this, like whatever conflict means to you. But if you just see it as a conversation, it can just take off this huge pressure element to it as well. And
I think one of the other things that I feel like it wasn't a direct message in the book, but something I got from it was, I've always been so in awe of people who can, like, even in, I don't know, in like a market, people who negotiate and they're enjoying it, they're like having a laugh, they're having fun. And to me, it's like the most terrifying thing. I've gone into markets before and like tried to do it and just failed miserably and just felt absolutely embarrassed. And what I got a lot from the book is how to enjoy it a bit more, make it something of value to both you and them. It's not about getting everything for yourself. And I think that's what stopped me from enjoying negotiations in the past, is that I felt like, oh, you know, I'm trying to get something that isn't mine. And actually it's not that. Negotiating is about finding a fair deal for both of you and making sure that everyone's getting what they're worth and making it an enjoyable process. So another book that we both read that we absolutely loved was Nonviolent Communication, which was also quite earlier on in the year, wasn't it?
This one was amazing. Again, like for one of the books, I'd say there's a couple of them that the title doesn't really do it justice. So like Nonviolent Communication, like for me, I can't remember what I thought when I first read that, but people had recommended it to me before. So I was like, okay, let's give it a go. But I think don't have the word violent in it. Just seems a bit daunting. So I think the way I'd really describe it is like, how can you just communicate better with other people and really understanding, having a new language for yourself. There's something he talked about, which for me was really poignant in it, when he says, like, we've just never been given the right tools and language to sometimes describe what's going on for us. Like we have the top level, I'm feeling angry about something or being a bit disappointed, but you just don't really actually know why. Like, and it's frustrating for you because you're feeling that, but then you're trying to communicate normally with other people. And then it's really hard to do that when you haven't got the terminologies. It was like just another, kind of tool or another kind of language to just describe kind of why things are impacting you in a certain way, so someone else can really get it.
It's one of those books I think that you read and you're like, this makes so much sense, but you never would have thought about it in that way. And I think it's also a book you wouldn't normally pick up. I was recommended the book by my mentor, Claire James. Shout out to Claire. And it's something that, you know, you kind of hear about maybe in mentoring or coaching circles, but it's not really one of those that, you know, is on the front of the shelves. But it's such a gem. I think the best context to put this book in is when you're having a conversation or an argument with somebody where you're saying one thing, they're saying another thing, and you just can't somehow, even though it seems so clear to you what's going on, they're just not understanding you, and they're getting angry at you for not understanding them, and you're like, how can they not see what I'm saying and how I'm feeling? And this book really gives you a tool to help you get through those kind of conversations and both better understand yourself and others. And I think that's the main thing that I got out of it, is a lot of the time it's not, I was always trying to understand others better, but actually this book tells you that actually if you can understand yourself better and be able to not only that, but communicate it in a way that others can understand and really connect with, then that can help you understand others in the kind of because of that.
As I say as well, so another book that you read that was kind of a little bit on the line of this was Sapiens, which again is on my reading list for this year. Were there similarities? I think there's a lot from what you guys are sharing in the book review that, sounds kind of similar.
You know what, strangely, on the face of it, you wouldn't put those two books like next to each other in terms of doing a similar thing. But Sapiens was just a book that I think the more time goes on since I've read it, the more impact it's making on me, which is really interesting. Like, it always comes back into mind as I'm like learning new things now. So for most of you have probably heard of Sapiens if you're listening to this. It's quite a popular book. It's quite a big book. It's probably one of the longest ones we've read. It's basically the story of humans, how we came to be, and what kind of things we got up to throughout our lifetime, and why we are where we are now. But even though it seems almost like a scientific or biological book, it's actually so much about economics, about behavior, about the way that we feel and why we behave in certain ways, and why our economy or politics are in a certain state. And it just gives you this overarching view of the world. It's a little bit of a sad book. I think when I finished reading it, I remember feeling quite depressed after I'd read it, because it seems like the guy who's written it doesn't really like humans that much, I think, in the nicest way, because there's so much that we've done to the world that has changed it. So 100% worth reading. I can't even describe it, to be honest, but definitely worth a read. I think so. There's two books that made the biggest impact for me on a business perspective, right? So we've talked about a couple of books, some business, some more like personal growth. And I think the two top business books for me, which I know some people don't like these books as well, so it's quite interesting. The first one is 0 to 1, and that's by Peter Thiel, who was the founder of PayPal, co-founder of PayPal. And 0 to 1 is basically provides a blueprint of what it takes for companies to go from 0 to 1, so from being nothing to being something amazing, and what creates these outlier companies compared to all these ones that don't make it. But I do feel like what I've read in this book I haven't read anywhere else. And I like that about business books, because there's so many that do say the same thing in a different way, which is fine, because everyone needs to look at things in different perspective. But 0 to 1 is probably the first book I've read that provided a different perspective on how businesses grow. And the other one was That Will Never Work, by Mark Randolph, who was the first I'm confusing it with another book, by Mark Randolph, who was the founder of Netflix. And it just tells you the really raw story of how Netflix came to be. And the thing I loved about that story is that most business story books tell you, I had this awesome idea, next thing you know, it's huge and we're making loads of money. Whereas this one tells you it starts from before he had the idea. I love that. And he's talking about, the kind of things he's thinking about, and they're literally brainstorming different business ideas. And then it happens, they get the right idea, they get the investment, and they talk about how the wires weren't working well in the office. Like, they go to the tiniest detail, and you feel like you're there. You feel like you're experiencing Netflix from the start. And I just found it really empowering. I think anybody who wants to start a business and wants to know the real story should read it, except for the fact they got like £3 million investment straight away. That's very rare. But everything else.
Yeah, I think that's the same. I did exactly the same thing. When we read it, I think I said, looking at a really big company that everyone knows, that would say, everyone's like, Netflix, super successful business. It was really, the word I used a lot was tangible. Like, it felt like anyone could kind of do it. Like, it was like I said, like, we're discussing even just ideas and how they came up with the idea and the evolution of an idea. It wasn't like they'd figured out what Netflix was going to be and look like today on the first day. It was like years and years, and like what it started off with looks nothing like what it does today. And I think that was really refreshing, because I think it's a lot sometimes of people feeling like the idea as in its first form has to be the make or break, and actually allowing it to evolve and adapt is something that's really critical. And it was really like just nice to hear that. But I think you're right. Like, the biggest thing that was for me when I saw it, like we were just reading it around this investment thing. I think it was like after 5 years, towards even the end of the book, they're like, oh yeah, we need to actually start making this profitable. Like, we need to figure out how we're going to make, like, because they were just literally just eating away at investment. And for me, it was just like, felt a bit mad, like, what have you been doing for 5 years, not figuring out if the value proposition is like is viable.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it was actually, yeah, just really interesting that. But so like, that kind of interesting, because I said they had obviously a lot of money to go and play around with stuff. But it also was a really nice way of just seeing the evolution of an idea and seeing, I think even at the end of the book, they haven't even put it on like the stock market. So like, it's not even at that stage, it's really early stages of it. So yeah, I think it was a really interesting one for sure. I think it was one of the top ones as well for me.
Definitely. It just mortalizes this huge company that you think, oh, that could never be something that I could do.
Yeah.
Yeah, just when you break it down to like day to day, what they were thinking, what they were doing, it just makes you think like businesses that are so successful are all about what you think you can do. It's really isn't anything to do with how great the idea is, because that can change. If you can persevere, and if you believe in it more than anything, no matter how crap the idea is at the beginning or that doesn't make money, you will make it work. It just gives you that belief. Anything else that was a big one for you?
So the other one is actually one of the ones we read at the end, which is probably why it's just kind of fresh in my head and feeling very poignant, which is another one that I'm not a big fan of the title, which is Key Person of Influence. Because again, influence for me sometimes have quite negative connotations, but it was just saying like, how can you actually just, for me, it was like, how can you communicate better who you are and what you can do for other people, whether that's as an individual or as a company. And it's one thing that we've talked about as well this year, of like, sometimes a frustration actually of like when you think you can support people, or there's something you've got that other people would find valuable, but the dots aren't quite joining, and just realizing for myself that like, I know everything I know about myself or about my business, and my actual job is just to get that information to other people, like give them what they need to make that decision better. And if you don't give them that, like, of course they're not going to make a decision about that. So for me, it was really just about how you can communicate what you know in a powerful way, and let people give everyone what they need to make that decision to kind of work with you. And again, very process driven. It's Daniel Priestley, isn't it? So he's again also read 24 Assets, which again, very structured. So again, I loved it. I was like, great lists of things to do in a certain flow. So it was I kind of like the structure. It's very, again, simplified. He does repeat himself quite a lot, but I guess it's about making the point over and over again. But it was just nice to kind of look at, okay, these are the things that if you like, make a little difference here, focus some time on things and think it through a little bit. I think he's a really nice way of, even just like his way of, like his pitch structure is just really clear and be like, make it like this, include this, that kind of thing. So like, yeah, just very tangible for anyone who's wanting to look at that stuff and just sit down and actually like get the work done.
Yeah, I love that. And it might not be like the most groundbreaking book we've read this year, but it's probably affected us quite a lot more than we think, because we're both actually planning on doing things in the new year because of what we read in that book. And I think anyone who's interested in personal brand or like this whole, creating influence aspect, it's such a great book to read, because I think I've read quite a few books with the title influence in them. Just looking at my bookshelf, I've got a number of books of like how to be influential, all this kind of stuff, because I'm really interested in the whole personal brand side of things. But all those books are so deeply theoretical and tell you stories about people, and they don't give you the practical step-by-step guide to do things. And Key Person of Influence does. It literally, if you, all you have to do then is put in the time.
Yeah.
And, read Atomic Habits, so you actually get into a habit of doing things.
Cool. So that's a little summary of some of the books that have had an impact for us this year. We've curated a list of them on a website called bookshop.org. If you've not come across it yet, it's a B Corp, and they're basically trying to support independent bookstores.
And also, if you're interested in being held accountable and getting those books read this coming year, if you've been putting it off for a while, then you can join our book club. So it's being hosted by Platform 9. It's called Level Up Club. And we read one book every month, always nonfiction, either business or self-mastery themed. And just drop me a message if you want to join, and I'll add you to our book club group. And then you can come along, see what it's like, and actually get those books read that you've been putting off for a while.